Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Hi, folks. Welcome to Cosmic Shenanigans. This is Mary SanGiovanni, and as always, I'm up to shenanigans of cosmic proportions. We are in part 2 of our analysis of The Fall of Cthulhu, a graphic novel series, which is written by Michael Allen Nelson and features a rotating cast of artists and colorists, which I think is interesting. We discussed a little bit last week about the effect of the different kinds of art styles on the story itself. What we're going to be talking about today is part 2. And again, I refer to them as parts because they're not issues specifically. Several issues seem to be connected in each part, and those issues seem to be related to that direct storyline, although all 6 of the parts are one big continuous story. In part 2, called The Gathering, what we have primarily is a focus on Nyarlathotep's group of loyal commanders, I guess. You can't really say they're minions, although I suppose everybody is a minion to an elder god. But they seem to hold places of various importance, something above the average drone, in the criminal enterprise that Nyarlathotep is running here. This part, I believe, shows us primarily the events from the monster's point of view. Now, I know we've talked about this in past episodes, but this is almost the antithesis of Lovecraft's notion of the outside and of that terrifying other. It's also often circumvented in modern cosmic horror by making those motivations that the monsters have behind their thoughts and feelings either very alien or frighteningly human. It is, I think part of the horror is derived from this question of whether it's more terrifying to think of our gods as utterly above human emotion, or just as capricious as humans because of it. And by that, I mean, if you look at something like, say, the Judeo-Christian God, who is considered to be above human emotion, whose motivations are, well, this is God's will, who are we to know God's will? Everything must happen for a purpose. If God were not a benevolent God, that would be pretty terrifying. Or you have something like the Greek and Roman pantheon, where they were often subject to the same fallibility as human beings, but they would be like human beings with superhuman powers. So there's something sort of terrifying in that. What I feel that this comic book does is sort of a mix of both. We don't always understand why they do stuff, but we do see glimpses into how they think. And for somebody like me who loves the monster part of monster fiction, I always find it fascinating when they delve into the psychology or the psyche of various monsters, because I think that, monsters being a particular symbol, especially in cosmic horror, for certain fears that we have, it's interesting to understand the drives behind those fears, the motivations behind those fears, and the personification of those fears, what that would mean for us if our fears had a sentience and a purpose. The first, I guess really the first loyal companion, we'll call them companions. The first companion that we're introduced to, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, is Sisyphix. Sisyphix is, and we get more of Sisyphix's backstory in later issues, later parts of this series. But essentially what we know of her in part 2 is that she's sort of a shapeshifter. Whatever she looks like underneath this sort of hot chick exterior, we're not really sure, although it's something pretty monstrous. I mean, we see various incarnations of her attack mode, for lack of a better way to say it. And she's pretty monstrous, but she can change shape and she can kind of take on the appearance of a human being. And for the most part, in this part, it's a fairly attractive human being. What I like about the cosmic horror use of shape shifting is that, and this is true if you think about it, this is true with Nyarlathotep, whose one of his monikers was that he was the god of 1,000 faces, or 10,000 faces, that he was constantly changing, that he wore masks. And that's as we talked about last week, that's a pretty important theme throughout this series, is this idea of wearing masks and what's under masks and how easily we change masks, how easily we change ourselves, how malleable we are, and how fleeting any real sense of one identity actually is. And that's a fairly common cosmic horror theme, is the idea that nothing about us is forever, that we are very tenuous, both physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and mentally. We're a very fleeting species, I suppose, and also very malleable. But so are the gods. Not so much fleeting. They are almost the opposite of us in that regard, but they are just as malleable. One of the themes I've noticed, and we're going to address this a little bit later on, is this idea that the things that are the most power, the things that serve the gods well in terms of their own abilities, are also the things that are the biggest burdens for them. And that is passed on to us. I think we talked a little last week about this idea that knowledge is both a blessing and a curse as far as they're concerned. So, but before we get ahead of ourselves on that, this idea of them shape-shifting is in keeping with the ability and the godlike freedom which Nyarlathotep seems to appreciate and respect. So pretty much all of his companions have some manner of shape-shifting ability like he does. And again, I think it's because there's this idea of freedom from the physical restraints of lesser beings, lesser entities. Now, Sisyphix is somewhere between a daughter and a companion to Nyarlathotep. And I say that because while there is no romantic or overtly sexual connection between her and Nyarlathotep, at least maybe not as far as he's concerned, he refers to her as an old friend. And he actually waives her attempts at deference. And he literally does that for no one else. She tries to address him in a manner of a servant. And he said, we're old friends. There's no need for that. You don't need to do that. And he does that for no one else. So there is a certain, and I know that it's weird that I'm sounding surprised by this. In a human character, we would automatically assume that at some point, even a psychopath or a sociopath would find somebody that he or she cares about enough to, relate to in kind of human terms. We don't expect that from the elder gods of Lovecraft's mythos, that there is no sense of real loyalty unless it's out of fear, and that there's no sense of affection for others. And this includes their own children. This includes their parents. This includes, there's no concept in the pantheon of, mates. The elder gods don't mate with each other in any kind of loving sort of way at all. So it's interesting to see that Nyarlathotep seems to care about her, at least superficially enough that he's willing to, defer the reverence that he believes he is owed from pretty much every entity that is not an elder god. And again, this particular characterization of Nyarlathotep, he's big into posturing, which I always thought was kind of beneath godlike entities, but it seems to continually characterize a lot of elder entities in modern cosmic horror. And, you see it even in like Judeo-Christian stories about the devil, where there's this idea of like, well, I don't need to do that. I am a god. You will bow down before me. I don't know that gods even think that they need to tell you that. Gods would just sort of assume that. But while I would approach them as beings who consider us beneath the requirement to explain themselves, we do get a sense that Nyarlathotep, if any elder god, has a strange relationship with human beings and is not only willing to engage them in conversation. First of all, most of the elder gods don't even know we exist. But even physical interaction to an extent. He also seems a little more prone to reacting to them or to acting like them. And unlike other elder gods who are for the most part barely aware, as I said, that we even exist, that they're sort of all-powerful, directionless forces of nature, Nyarlathotep is separated from them as a messenger. And thus he behaves differently. And Lovecraft never delves into this part of, I guess, the psychology of the messenger of the gods, that he might be somehow affected or infected by his contact with humanity. But I think it's kind of an interesting approach and would explain a lot of things that, again, I think would be difficult to characterize if you were going to delve into the psychology of something so foreign and alien to us. We also have a little boy in this issue who starts off as, your average 10 or 11-year-old boy, really nice kid. It's his birthday. His mom takes him to a comic book store to get some comics, and Sisyphix happens to be there, and she gives him the wrong kind of present. And I don't mean that in a dirty sort of way. I mean that she gives him access to, she tells him, what little kid is not tempted by the idea of being given superpowers? And she promises that if he opens this box, he'll have superpowers. Well, he most certainly does. He most certainly does cash in on this particular present. And what it does is it is the catalyst for Jacob's descent into corruption. Okay. One of the things that is not explicitly stated, but is, clearly implied throughout the issues, is that these companions of the elder gods, these demigods, I guess, which are not quite as powerful as old ones, certainly not as powerful as elder gods, but are of a demigod-like status anyway. They need vessels. They need physical bodies here because, for the most part, they don't have them wherever they have been banished to. So Jacob's descent into corruption allows him to be a vessel of Gunruk. And again, in names where vowels are missing, you do the best you can. Gunruk is a night gaunt-like demon demigod type thing. He is the son of Sisyphix. How that is possible, how that was done, we are not really given information about, but she refers to him as her child, and he refers to her as mother. So there is clearly that now whether Nyarlathotep is the father, we're not sure. As I said, there's no overtly sexual content regarding their relationship, but he functions like a child too. He functions almost as the personification of all the things that, and it sounds funny to say, but all the things that terrify people about children. He is a bottomless gullet of cosmic hunger. He serves to devour, and he's directionless unless his mother tells him or Nyarlathotep tells him, go do this. So it's sort of fitting that he uses the body of a child to synthesize a physical form that he needs. He does not look like a child, though. He looks like a gargoyle. Then we have, and this is an interesting character. When this particular character is introduced, the style of the art changes again. And again, as we talked about, when you have different artists doing different issues, sometimes that happens and it's a little bit disconcerting. In this case, I feel like it was deliberate because the way this character sees the world is different than all of the other human beings and gods and demigods and whatnot. They call this character Mary, although they do indicate that is not her real name. That it is a name that they gave her so that they have a name for her. She appears as a little girl, but she is always wearing masks, and we're going to come back to that. The way that she sees the dream world is beautiful. In all of the issues of part 1 and the issues in part 2 up until this point, when we see the harlot, a character I mentioned last week, who is a kind of demigod personification of lust, of the frightening side of lust, she sees the harlot as beautiful. When the harlot shows up in scenes where she is, moving through the landscape, she sees the harlot as beautiful. She sees the landscape as beautiful. And in all other depictions of the dreamlands, it's kind of a surreal and terrifying place, but not to her. The monsters, okay? The monsters appear to be creatures, and despite their monstrous characteristics, they're not grotesque. They're not ugly. The art doesn't depict them that way. It depicts them as almost, I don't want to say statuesque. That's not right. But almost sort of noble in their appearance. What she is, I suppose, is the masked mute. That's what they call her when they don't call her Mary. But she is, much like Nyarlathotep, a girl of 1,000 faces. She has masks under masks under masks under masks. We get the idea from certain issues that beneath the final mask is the true face of insanity and horror. And her personality is such that she comes across, maybe of all the characters, both human and not human, she comes across as being the most insane, and in some ways maybe the most terrifying, because her simple childlike wonder at the world is characterized by the utter brutality of a child of a monster. That sense of children not having developed a moral compass at all, like when little kids step on ants and don't feel anything, that's her. She's a stepper honor of ants, and in this case, ants would be human beings. She is insanity. Okay, she's sort of a personification of insanity. And what I think is interesting is that her masks serve as both communication, the way she talks, because again, she's mute. She can't talk. She thinks. We get a lot of captions of her thinking, and she thinks in almost beautiful and poetic terms, but she's a monster. And the masks are a way of communicating. They're a way of her expressing magic power. They're expression in general, and they're also of utter freedom. Okay, she mentions that a person could be beautiful. A person can have a beautiful, beautiful face, but they only ever get to have that one face. She gets to have many faces. She gets to have faces for pretty much every whim that she has. And we come to find out that she is Nyarlathotep's daughter, of course, and he is the ultimate wearer of masks. All right. We also have the role of a human being, and this is probably the only human being that I would say is, at least as far as Nyarlathotep is concerned, elevated to the level of confidant that these other companions, these other non-human companions are. His role essentially is as a personal servant. For the most part, he goes out and does all the little odd jobs that Nyarlathotep doesn't want to do. He'll go out and he is the messenger of the messenger for to put a finer point on it. But his ultimate role is to serve as the vessel of Gith. And again, I want to pause here and mention that in Lovecraftian stories, invariably, any vessel for gods or magic or anything has always been women. And in this particular case, all of the vessels that are chosen, again, Sisyphix is a separate situation because she is conjured a different way. All the vessels are men. And it's just sort of an interesting divergent path there. Now, as far as what Gith is supposed to be, he's the quiet one. Thank you. Brian just brought me tea so that I can wow you with my continued alertness and attention to this.
Hi, folks.
Gith is a god of pestilence. He doesn't come across as being terribly bright, but he is very powerful and obviously very contagious. And again, he's kind of the quiet one. In this part, though, we are more focused on the vessel, which is Connor, and how that vessel came to be. And we get this really sort of kind of heartbreaking glimpse of, we don't get a full flashback, but we get glimpses of the flashback. And in some ways that's more horrible. It's like being dropped with this, blink of horror for a second. And then before you have time to process it, they move on to something else. His grandmother evidently taught him to kill and bleed dogs. The violence of this at such an early age broke his psyche and introduced in him this incredible bloodlust. Now, he's interesting that Nyarlathotep, and this is true in both Lovecraft stories and in this comic book, Nyarlathotep generally tends to look for the innocent, because corruption and the, spreading chaos is kind of his bag. That's what he does. Corrupting entire nations, corrupting children, corrupting the innocent is one of his things that he does for, I think, himself as much as he does for any of the elder gods. But Connor is one of the few human beings that is chosen by Nyarlathotep for his corruption, that already exists, rather than an innocence to corrupt, in order to be a vessel eventually for the god of pestilence, in order to be such a loyal companion to this elder god. And Nyarlathotep points it out to him. I picked you because of what you already were, which was this sort of broken psychopath. What I also think is kind of interesting about this particular character is that Nyarlathotep genuinely seems to care about him. And again, as we said, when it comes to elder gods, the idea that there is any kind of affection for these characters, for anything human, is almost kind of laughable. It would be like, having an affection for a cricket, which I suppose could happen, if you have a pet cricket, maybe. And maybe that's how he sees Connor. Maybe he sees Connor as a pet. But there does seem to be an affection, and he does tell him things like, well, you're a good boy. You're a good boy. And his loyalty and his unquestioning loyalty is very important to Nyarlathotep, like very important. And again, we get this little glimpse into a what, if not a why, as to how this god interacts. But we're also, through Connor, introduced to Nyarlathotep's bottomless capacity for cruelty. Okay? Now, for so many millennia, he's interacted with human beings. Maybe all of that interaction has allowed him to develop feelings of hurt, feelings of feeling betrayed. You wouldn't think that an elder god would care, but he does. Connor has a moment of doubt in Nyarlathotep's plan in participating in this. And he goes out to a bar. He kind of runs away, I guess. And Nyarlathotep and Sisyphix go and find him and bring him back, And at first there's sort of this affectionate, like, oh, you rascal, Connor's very apologetic. He feels a lot of remorse for having this moment of doubt. What Nyarlathotep does is that, in order to have him serve as a vessel for Gith, it's just his body that they need. So they put his brain in a jar, sort of a Amigo situation here, and leave him in the dark, because this way he can sleep, he can rest, And then when they're done with their plan, Gith will go back to where he goes back to the Dreamlands, and Connor gets his body back. Nyarlathotep promised him this. And as I mentioned last week, the idea of keeping promises is very important, at least as far as the way the gods and the demigods are characterized in this comic series. Again, you wouldn't think that an elder god would care about keeping up. It'd be like keeping a promise to a grasshopper, but they do. And he says to Connor, I know that I told you that when we were done, you could have your body back. I promised you that. I'm not going to break that promise. But because you doubted me, I'm not going to let you rest. And so basically what he does is he turns the jar, because basically he's a jar and eyeballs at this point, Connor, and he turns the jar into the light to face a mirror, so that for the entire time that Connor is disembodied, he has to stare at the horror of what he really is at this point, with the full understanding on Nyarlathotep's part that this will probably drive the boy mad. Now, that again seems very extreme, but it shows, I think, the depth and breadth of cruelty that this character, that over several issues we have seen Nyarlathotep show an affection for. It is, again, not an affection as a friend, but as a pet. And as not even a beloved pet, but a pet that you have no real qualms about kicking or leaving outside in the winter. It does bring up another theme, which is going to be important throughout the issues that we're going to talk about, that in many cases, moving someone out of the blessed ignorance of darkness and into the light of understanding is a punishment of the gods. But it's also a burden that they bear themselves. And again, it goes back to this idea that every power that the gods have is also a punishment. Now, whether the gods see it that way is unclear, but they fully understand that imparting those powers to a human being is both an extreme power and one that maybe we can't handle. So it also serves as a punishment, and that is a common theme throughout the rest of the series as well. This idea that I can give you a certain degree of unlimited power, but it's going to hurt you, and I know that. Be human. There are things that humans are not meant to know. And that is, I think, at the root, one of the foundations of cosmic horror, both Lovecraftian and modern cosmic horrors, that there are some things that we are just not meant to know or meddle with. So that's it for this week. We will be, for the remainder of the year, probably tackling the other 4 issues in this series. It's really kind of a cool series. And again, it looks at Lovecraftian horror in a cosmic horror, modern cosmic horror lens, which I think is kind of cool. If you enjoyed this episode and want to listen to past episodes, you can check me out at Project Entertainment Network, iTunes, which I think is now Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, the Project Entertainment Network itself, all places where podcasts are available. You can also check out The Horror Show with Brian Keene, which I co-host with the eponymous Brian Keene. That is also available in all those same locations. And if you want to do a solid for our engineer, Matt Wilderson, you could check out Grindcast. That's his podcast that he does. It talks about pop culture and video games and often cosmic horror-y goodness in and of itself. So I appreciate you listening, and I'll see you next week. Bye.
The Unsupervised Podcast, a show about acceptance and diversity.
I guarantee you these are all white children.
You gotta shoot your shot, man.
Oh, Mick, do you want some rhinoceros?
A show about love.
It's called like a chicken McGangbang. It's like
Whoa, I'm the chicken McGangbang.
I'm always grumpy, so I want to dominate it.
Not part of the Pound Me Too movement.
With some high-class humor and some science.
You need to move your lips more.
Give me another rim job.
The popcorn gives you a boner? I don't get this.
It's science, okay?
Okay, maybe more like the Seinfeld of podcasts, not really about anything specific, but we're going to make you laugh and entertain you for a little while. So tune in every Thursday exclusively on Project Entertainment Network.